Welcome back to another episode of Microeconomics. Today we're in Chapter 12, looking at something called monopolistic competition. So it sounds like a contradiction. Monopoly means no competition, but then there's competition. So there's a specific meaning for this phrase. Now, perhaps you're wondering, we are going a little bit out of order with the chapters. We're not skipping Chapter 11. We will come back to it. I just thought that'd be better to go through this chapter first, and also chapter 13, before coming back to chapter 11. So the first thing we'll do in this chapter is look at different kinds of market structures. So one market structure is perfect competition. We learned about that already in a previous chapter. Another kind of market structure is monopoly, where there's only one seller. We learned about that also in a previous chapter. Now there's two cases that are in between those two extremes, and one of them is called monopolistic competition. We'll learn about the other one in the next chapter, chapter 13, which is about oligopolies. So once we define what monopolistic competition is, we'll look at the short run and also the long run. Then we'll also do analysis of how it affects social welfare. So we saw earlier, just for comparison, that under perfect competition, total surplus is maximized, so competitive markets are efficient. We also saw that typically monopolies are not efficient. They reduce total surplus, and that's not good for society. We'll see where monopolistic competition is going to fall in that spectrum. So once we get through all that, we'll then look at advertising. Advertising can be much more important for monopolistic competition than it is for perfect competition and for oligopolies, so that's going to get more attention here than in the previous chapters where we basically ignored it. So let's get started by looking at different market structures. So there are four main categories. We learned about perfect competition already back in chapter 9. That means you have many sellers and also many buyers. The products the firms are selling are very similar to each other. Also, there is free entry and exit. So a firm can enter the market costlessly, or an old firm can decide to leave the market, again, costlessly. All firms are price takers under perfect competition. We defined that term earlier. A price taker just means that you have no ability to influence price. So every firm in this market is so small that what they do is not going to impact the market price. They set the prevailing market price as given, and they just can't alter it. We saw the other end of the extreme in the last chapter, that was about monopolies. Instead of having just many sellers, now there's just one seller. So the issue of similar products is not really relevant here. There's only one seller, so only one product. Now, monopolies can be very lucrative, so that would tempt new firms to enter if that were possible. So one condition to maintain monopoly status is there has to be barriers to entry. It can't be easy for new firms to enter the market and start adding more competition and taking away the firm's profits. Otherwise, monopolist status would be very short-lived indeed. So the opposite of being a price taker is that you have market power, the ability to influence price. So when there's only one seller in monopoly, they're going to have the most influence you can possibly have over a price. So their market power is maximized. So those are the extreme cases. Now let's look at the intermediate. So we'll look at here is what's called monopolistic competition. So like perfect competition, there are many sellers and also many buyers. Now one difference is that the products are now a little bit different. Not every firm's product is the same, and we'll see a number of examples of that in the coming slides. So for example, for clothing companies, there are lots of places they'll sell you a shirt or sell you a sweater, but each brand is a little bit different, and some brands are more fashionable than others. So products are a little bit different, and consumers have different preferences over those products. Now, like perfect competition, there will be free entry and exit, so new firms can enter this market easily, and old firms can leave quite easily. Because the products are a little bit different, now firms have a little bit of market power. So, because consumers have made their favorite brand, they could be willing to pay a little bit extra to get their favorite brand rather than switch to some competitor. Now, in a perfect competition, you're all selling the same thing, so if one firm raises their price, you're going to stop buying from them. You're going to start buying from another firm that's cheaper because they'll sell you the same thing for a lower price. You're going to go for that. Now, if you believe that firm's product is special in some way, if it's actually different from its competitors, now if that firm raises its price, you might not flee to competition. So the monopolistically competitive firm does have some ability to raise prices, unlike perfect competition. So going a bit further down the spectrum, and we'll learn a lot more about this in the next chapter, is what's called an oligopoly. That has only a few sellers. That's a big difference between oligopolies and monopolistic competition. Oligopolies do have differentiated products. That's a similarity with monopolistic competition. There are not quite as many options because there are not quite as many firms. So we're getting towards the less competitive end of the spectrum here. So oligopolies, because there's less competition, can make some pretty nice profits that would not last if any firm could enter the market for free. So now there are some barriers to entry, and that's why there are so few sellers in an oligopolistic market. So if fewer competition, or less competition, that's going to increase the market power, increase the ability of the firm to influence price under oligopoly. So as you can see, perfect competition and monopoly are two extremes. The intermediate cases which occur much more frequently are monopolistic competition and oligopoly. So in this chapter, we're going to focus on monopolistic competition. So very, very common. There are lots and lots of examples to think of very easily. Restaurants are a monopolistically competitive industry. So lots of different kinds of restaurants, lots of product differentiation. So some examples I have up on the slide. Applebee's, IHOP, Burger King, Texas Roadhouse, they're all a little bit different. So you might have a favorite among those four, and that can make you settle in to prefer that brand over other brands. Those firms therefore have the ability to influence price because people might stick to their favorite brand even if the price got a little bit higher. So that market's a very clean example of monopolistic competition. Another example is music. Now, let's be clear about what is going on here compared to what I was saying earlier in chapter 10. Each musician has a monopoly over the music they create. So you might feel it as a monopoly in that sense, but it's really more like monopolistic competition that's going on here. That's because while each song might be unique and each band might have a copyright exclusive rights over that song, there are lots and lots of similar bands out there selling very similar music in the same genres, so that's going to create a lot of competition. So the bands have some ability to influence price over their music, but if they try to make their music really expensive, you can find other bands pretty similar and it's cheaper, so their market power is constrained in that way. So that's another industry that's monopolistically competitive. Now, to avoid confusion, here are some industries that are not examples of monopolistic competition. The market for autos is not monopolistically competitive. That's more like an oligopoly. That's because there's only a handful of major car companies, just 3 in the US and some major ones around the world, that also offer competition. Nevertheless, still a pretty small number overall, so that's more like an oligopoly and less like monopolistic competition. Also, there are big barriers to entry in making cars. Remember we said back here that barriers to entry is an important factor in determining what kind of market structure you have. Building your own auto manufacturing plant is really, really expensive. So that's going to deter new competitors from trying to join this market. On the other hand, restaurants, just about anyone can set up their own restaurant. That's not terribly hard to do, so it might not be literally free entry next to, but it's pretty close to free entry. Some regular people who have a fondness for cooking can open up business, and that's not terribly hard. Oil is also not an example of Monopolistic competition, that's more like an oligopoly. It's a handful of major oil producing countries around the world, so that's a small number of sellers. Also, some very high barriers to entry. Buying an oil field is not going to be cheap, and also buying the equipment to extract oil from your field is also very much not cheap. That's going to make it hard for new competitors to enter the market. So it's been a cartel, OPEC it's called, that has had a lot of influence over oil for decades and decades. They've been able to maintain that because of barriers to entry. It's not easy for a new firm to open up and start producing oil. So that's what monopolistic competition is and is not. Now let's explore one feature of that market structure, which is differentiation of products. So unlike with pure competition, not all the firms are selling the same thing. So one way in which products can differ is in the style. So in restaurants, there are many different kinds of restaurants out there. There are high-end restaurants and low-end restaurants. So there's things like McDonald's or Burger King on the low end. There are plenty of people who have a very tight budget or don't really care a lot about quality. And alternatively, there's also some very expensive restaurants where you could spend a lot of money on just one meal. Styles also differ. Um, you could have different kinds of food, like Chinese food or Mexican food, stuff like that. Another example with like high-end or low-end restaurants, I probably should have gone over here under quality. That's really a different way, but still that products are differentiated. Location also can be a way in which firms can separate themselves. So here's one example. I worked at Truman State University in Missouri for 4 years, and I went to one of two barber shops if I needed a haircut. So one barber shop was located in a very convenient area of town. I could just walk to it from my office, and it was only 2 or 3 blocks. They also had lower prices. So unsurprisingly, you have this attractive location and low prices. That's going to drive a lot of traffic and a lot of business. So that was very nice about that barbershop, but the drawback is that it got so appealing, there's often a line, so it'd take a long time to wait before I could get my haircut. There used to be people ahead of me in line usually. So what I started doing is that I started going to this other barber shop that was located maybe, I want to say a mile, but it's not quite a mile, probably like 2/3 of a mile away. If you're further from campus, and the college is a pretty big part of Kirksville, there's going to be fewer customers. He also charged a bit more money, which also means fewer customers. But as a result, I had very short wait times and often no wait time at all. So that was an advantage. So the firms could compete not just on price or style, it's kind of the same haircut either way, but on location, and that created a trade-off, and both sides have their advantages. Firms can also compete along the dimension of quality. So maybe some of you guys buy cheap beer to entertain yourselves. When you're more affluent, perhaps you'll start becoming one of those wine connoisseurs who spends hundreds of dollars on a bottle. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, but some people really do care about that and are willing to pay the big bucks for the high quality. So another way firms can differentiate their products. So you can see that this kind of market, the products are very much not all the same. So that's how the market structures work, and that's what monopolistic competition is and is not. Let's stop here, and we'll have another episode up shortly about the short run, the long run, and social welfare.